We are now in a situation of high sensitivity to initial conditions. Even a single individual, if they are in the right place at the right time or the wrong place in the wrong time, they can push the trajectory either to a really chaotic civil war or put it on the trajectory of reforms and renovation. But fortunately, these crisis periods are always take a long time to resolve. And unfortunately, fast resolution usually requires a sea of blood.
Today I'm joined by complexity scientist Peter Turchin to discuss his most recent research analyzing the historical rise and fall of political tensions and turmoil in civilizations, including what that can tell us about the current state of social discourse in the United States and the world. Peter Turchin is a project leader at the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna, Austria, research associate at the University of Oxford, and emeritus professor at the University of Connecticut. He is also the founder of the field of cliodynamics, which is the application of mathematical and dynamical system approaches to the study of history. Peter has written several books, including his most recent, End Times, Elites, Counterelites, and the Path of Political Disintegration, which is the subject of today's conversation. Peter's work toward understanding the factors that nudge entire societies towards either revolutions and violence or reform and cooperation is, in my opinion, critical to avoid the collapse of the social contract, which is one of the five horsemen in my analysis at The Great Simplification. If you are enjoying this podcast, I invite you to subscribe to our Substack newsletter where you can read more of the system science underpinning the human predicament, where my team and I post special announcements related to The Great Simplification. You can find the link to subscribe in the show description. With that, please welcome Peter Turchin. Peter Turchin, longtime fan of your work. Good to see you.
Glad to be here.
So you have studied lots of topics that I am personally very interested in: ecology, evolution, zoology, history, sociology. What got you interested in all those things and putting them together?
Well, from the beginning, I was interested in working in interdisciplinary fields. So my training was as a complexity scientist, doing computational modeling, data analysis, and things like that, and applying that to population dynamics of animals. But then about, when I hit 40, I decided that I wanted to do something more challenging. And so it turns out that at that point, history, that was back in the 1990s, history was the only scientific discipline that has not been mathematized, not subjected to a complexity science approach. And that's why I started getting into that.
So just out of curiosity, did you ever read Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy, where he developed the concept of psychohistory? You sound like you kind of match up with that.
Yes, I read it when I was 20, but it actually did not have much influence on me. In fact, it has not had much influence on me because he wrote it way back after World War II, before we had any complexity science, before we had understanding of what is mathematical chaos. And so it is in many ways, his books, actually the trilogy, is quite naive. All right, but I'm not knocking him down. He is a great author. He's one of my favorite science fiction authors, no question about it.
So I'm going to get into your work. You've written over 200 peer-reviewed science articles and many books, but you just mentioned a term, mathematical chaos. Could you briefly define what you mean by that?
Well, it's actually a very important idea to understand the dynamics of our human societies, because human societies are complex systems. There are many different parts. They're interacting. There are feedback loops. And those nonlinear feedback loops result in producing unpredictable behavior, which is called mathematical chaos. It turns out that when you see some system behaving quite erratically, one possibility is that there is some kind of external force, a stochastic external force that actually drives the dynamics. But the other possibility is mathematical chaos. It's these multiple interactions within the system that generate those erratic-looking dynamics.
So you can predict that a system has mathematical chaos. Once you understand it has mathematical chaos, can the results be predicted beyond the present moment?
Only in the short-term future, because we never have perfect models for the systems that we study, even simple systems, like the planetary motions. And secondly, we never have perfect data. The problem with chaos is it's called sensitive dependence on initial conditions. So this is why we cannot predict weather more than 7 or 10 days in advance, because we cannot get the perfect snapshot of all the pressures and temperatures around the globe. We have, weather stations, but there is also stuff in between. And so because of that, the weather is predictable until the trajectories start to diverge from the predicted trajectory because of our uncertain knowledge of initial conditions. Hopefully this will not go too much overhead for your listeners, but that's the reason why, for example, in Isaac Asimov's psychohistory, it's not credible to predict the behaviors of human societies 200 years ahead, or even 1 year ahead.
Because as soon as the initial conditions change, it changes all the variables and it gets incredibly complex really fast, right?
That's right.
So this is why Dennis Meadows on a podcast here talked about the limits to growth model. And it wasn't a prediction of the 21st century. It was just a prediction of which scenarios would start to change at what point. But after the change inflection, beyond that, they weren't predictions. It was just potential scenarios.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly, as you may know, back in 2010, I published a prediction that the United States is gradually sliding into a crisis, which should hit somewhere in the 2020s. Now, that one thing about complex systems is that they can be in different regimes. So the road to crisis is actually fairly generalized. And that's, many hundreds of previous societies have followed on this very similar road on which United States was back in 2010, right? But once, you were just right, Dennis Meadows was quite right, once you get to the cusp, to the crisis, and the whole suite of avenues opens up for you. And that's where, small push by good leaders, for example, can either lead to good outcomes, so no civil war, no bloodshed, or it could throw the society into such chaos that everybody will be very upset.
So I want to start with your recent book called The End Times: Elites, Counterelites, and the Path of Political Disintegration, where you outline the cyclical nature of the rise and collapse of states, as well as the primary contributing factor to those cycles. Could you briefly outline what each of those contributing factors are?
Sure. So here in Vienna, I lead a group at Complexity Science Hub. It's called Social Complexity and Collapse. So we've actually amassed data on about 200 past societies that slide into crisis and then emerge from them. And so what we find is that complex human societies can actually function reasonably well, keep internal peace and order, maybe for a century, sometimes less, sometimes more. But then inevitably they get into situations of social turbulence, political disintegration, end times. So the question is, why? And our analysis showed that the most frequent factor that actually develops before the crisis is what we call elite overproduction. All right, so it's sort of like a game of musical chairs, all right, except that you don't take chairs out, you just keep adding players. So you start with 11 players, 10 chairs, one person is an angry loser, then that's 15, 20, 30, 40 players. You get a big crowd of angry losers. They start breaking rules. You can think back to 2016, for example, and what happened since then. And then you'll see that this is actually a good model for elite overproduction. So that is when the elites start becoming counter-elites, those losers who did not gain the power positions that they aimed for, right?
Former elites that were in the losing party, as an example.
Yeah, or the elites who were frustrated in getting into the power positions that they wished. Not every frustrated elite aspirant is going to turn into counter-elite. It takes a certain kind to do that. But the more losers you have, the more angry, frustrated elite aspirants you have, the higher is going to be the proportion. And then they start actually coalescing into a coalition to overthrow the ruling regime.
And what were the other factors? There was elite overproduction, and then there was some other factors, right, in your book?
Yeah, in fact, let's step back and ask, where does elite overproduction come from? Why does it usually develop after long periods of internal peace and order? So what happens is that the elites are simply power holders. All right, and the power comes in four different ways, as we know. First of all, it's coercion. Secondly, it's economic power. It's administrative power, and it's persuasion. All right, ideological power. All right, so when people are in power for a long time, generations change, and they get used to the system functioning well, and there is a temptation to reconfigure the system to function even better for themselves. Right, so they become, we call it the selfish phase of the elites. Right, and so what they do in different societies, they use different methods. But let's say in the medieval times, the lords would actually start oppressing peasants to extract more wealth from them. They turned on the wealth pump, which takes the wealth money from the poor, gives it to the rich. In the United States, this happened in 1970s. This is when the governing elites of our country have abandoned the New Deal institutions, most importantly, institutions that ensured that fruits of economic growth would be divided fairly between workers and owners and managers of businesses. I'm sure you and your readers have seen those famous graph, which shows the increase, how the productivity of American workers keeps increasing. And until late 1970s, compensation goes right in line with that. And then boom, compensation actually stops and even declines, whereas productivity keeps going up. So what happened to that gap? That's the wealth pump operating. All right. All of that money went to create newly wealthy people in the United States.
I'm really not happy that you only have an hour, because I have 3 hours of questions for you. But I will pick my best questions. So put on your zoology hat for a moment. Mm-hmm. Is the elite overproduction thesis that you have kind of a predictable, just observational outcome of a biological species with access to huge energy surplus, but the biological species is a social species that creates hierarchy? And then what ends up happening is just a power law when there's this surplus running through the system.
Well, although my PhD is in zoology, I am not a big fan of making direct comparisons, all right? So what's important, at a much more abstract level, the mathematical models and the frameworks we developed for studying population dynamics, they can work quite well for societal dynamics. But the actual mechanisms are different. It's not like predator-prey relations. It has to do, because humans are both predators and prey. All right. So we have to look at the differentials in power. So that gives us a small proportion of power holders. These are the elites. All right. And then everybody else, the commoders.
What percentage of a population are elites, roughly?
Roughly, it's 1 to 3%. But the whole point of elite overproduction is that the social pyramid becomes more top-heavy. And so that's why, let's go back to the wealth pump that has been operating in the United States since 1970s. Between 1980 and 2020, the number of uber wealthy, people who own $10 million or more in wealth, the households, right, increased by a factor tenfold, all right? The population has grown by a factor 40%, but we have 10 times as many decamillionaires as we had before. All right. So saying that clearly people who have $10 billion or more, they're part of the economic elites, right? Because they used to be 0.05%. Now they're close to 1%, but not quite.
So you're Russian, or a Russian ancestry. You were born in Russia. You hear in the news a lot about Russian oligarchs. Does the United States have an oligarch problem by a different label, perhaps?
Well, I actually grew up in the Soviet Union, a country that does not exist anymore, and I hope the United States will not do the same. But yes, so what happened in Russia, and actually I have a chapter in my book, End Times, talking about it, is that, first of all, during the run-up to the Russian Revolution, there was a huge overproduction of gentry, essentially, nobility. And in fact, the revolution was done not by peasants and workers. It was done by the frustrated members that came from those elite classes. All right, and fast forward to 1990, Soviet Union actually managed to solve this problem by essentially exterminating the previous ruling class or driving them into the commoner class, right? And it lasted for about 70 or so years, but then they had their own problems. They overproduced credentialed elites. We have not talked much about that, but this is very important to look both at the wealth route and the credentialed route. In particular, interestingly enough, they overproduced engineers, technical intelligentsia, so-called. And these are the ones who actually were in the squares and who overthrew the communist regime. All right, and that freed up a lot of people to generate a huge amount of wealth. The whole, even as the economy of Russia was collapsing in the 1990s, a number of newly wealthy billionaires actually were making huge amounts of money. And in fact, for a while, they controlled the government during the 1990s. Right, but then there was a sort of counter-revolution against them by the military and administrative elites led by Putin, essentially, and that's why the oligarchs now are either in exile or some of them actually died, and the rest who remain, they are thoroughly subordinated to the bureaucratic apparatus in modern Russia.
So why does the what you refer to as elite overproduction eventually lead to a collapse of society? Is it really the overproduction of elites, or is it the elites relative to the services available to the general person, and that delta gets wider and wider, or some other factors? How does elite overproduction manifest in collapse or societal decay?
Okay, well, yes, because we live in a complex society, the situation is a bit more complex than I portrayed it a minute ago. So let's unpack some of those, complexities. First of all, the wealth pump that I was talking about, it has three negative consequences. The first one is the stagnation and even decline of the living standards of the general population. That creates popular discontent. All right, and as a result of that, mass mobilization. There are many people who are willing, who are actually dislike the regime, and are willing to help anybody who wants to overthrow it. But by themselves, they have no power. They have no organizational power. They have no wealth. They have no persuasion, and so on and so forth. That's why overproduction of elites is critical. Once you see counter elites, appear in large numbers and they start coalescing, they are the ones who actually organize and channel popular discontent. All right. So the combination of immiseration and elite production, that's the explosive one. Also important are, I don't want to go into too much detail, but the state strength, it's first of all, how much legitimacy it has, right? And also its fiscal health. These are also important factors, although they are not ubiquitous. Sometimes they play in the road to crisis, sometimes they don't. And finally, the geopolitical situation also can be an important factor. But the two main ones is elite production together with immiseration.
Defining elites, there are four categories: the economic or financial, military or power, the ability to persuade, and administrative, as you said. Which category of those four is most dominant in the United States today, and how does this compare with the rest of the world?
So in the United States, the elites, the power holders, come from two routes. One is the wealth route, the other one is credentialed route. And that's why some commentators consider that we have the 1% who is the wealth power and the 10% who are the top, people who have especially professional degrees such as law, doctor or professor, and so on and so forth.
So I have a PhD in ecological economics, which very few people care about. Am I an elite?
So again, that there is no such hard ball, billiard ball. Okay, it's just as in the wealth categories, we have billionaires, people who have $100 million, $10 million, and then people like myself, right? And that same thing is in other hierarchies. So a columnist of New York Times is much more influential than columnist at Idaho Sun. And news, okay, right. So all sort of at different levels in this pyramid. So I've been lucky enough, even though I came penniless to this country 47 years ago or so, right? I've been lucky to get into the upper 10% essentially because of credentials and also accumulated, some pension money and so on and so forth. So this is actually gives me enough power over my life, all right, but not really much power over other people. Whereas somebody who is the president of the United States, right, they obviously have much more power over people. So this is a gradation thing. That's important to keep in mind.
So it sounds like if living standards are getting worse for the average person, which you term immiseration, and the elites, what we're experiencing now is a yo-yo pendulum swing between the elites and the counter-elites, who then become the elites again, and the elites become the counter-elites, and that whole process keeps yo-yoing until it breaks. Is that the trajectory that we're on?
Usually, it doesn't go back and forth. So if you look at other previous end times, like the French Revolution, right, the old elites, the nobility and the clergy, they were overthrown by a coalition of counter-elites. But then, as we know, a revolution tends to devour its children. So different segments of counter-elites eventually started fighting amongst themselves. And they also did quite a good job exterminating themselves. And by doing that, they essentially solved the problem of elite overproduction. All right, by eliminating all those extra surplus elites. So in the United States right now, we are at a very interesting cusp, because the way, looking through the lens of our theory, what happened on November 5 was a revolution, bloodless, fortunately, revolution in which a coalition of counter-elites came to power, all right, or at least is in the process of coming to power. We don't know what's going to happen in the next 2 months. Now, so you have the Democratic Party has become the home of the ruling class. And that happened because, first of all, they have abandoned their roots as a workers' party, back in the 1990s. But more recently, as Trump was taking over the Republican Party, right, many of the established Republicans bolted to the Democrats. So Liz Cheney and her father, neocons and so on and so forth. And there was the opposite movement of some Democrats like RFK Jr., Robert Kennedy Jr., or Tulsi Gabbard, who used to be Democrats, but now they are ardent Trump supporters. So we see this sorting out. It's very interesting. Republicans are in the process of becoming a party, as they say, the party of the working people, or as their critics say, the party of the extreme right-wing populism. All right, but we see this sorting in terms of theory between counter-elites and the ruling elites. Now, if Trump is successful, then the goal is clearly, judging by the kinds of people that he wants to appoint to the top position, and also what they want to do to the bureaucracy, right, which means decimate it, right? So the goal is to overthrow what they call the deep state or the established elites and replace them with a new crop of counter-elites. So that's how I interpret what's happening. But this revolution is still work in progress. There are many things that the ruling party can do to derail it in a variety of ways, as they were very successful in 2016 and the first term of Donald Trump.
So in your study, you said hundreds of historical societies. Every time that there was elite overproduction and immiseration in society, did it result in a collapse of that structure and those institutions, or were there times that it got close and was averted?
Well, first of all, it turns out collapse is a completely overused word.
I agree.
We now have about 200 of this crisis, all right? And it turns out that there's no such thing as a typical collapse. Each collapse is unhappy in its own way, as Anna Karenina, the heroes of Anna Karenina might have said, right? And that's what I meant, that once you get to the crisis, that road is pretty narrow. Right, but once you get to crisis, there's so many different possibilities. So you can one kind of collapse is when there is a demographic collapse. Another kind of collapse is political fragmentation, when the country ceases to exist and is replaced by a number of smaller countries, and so on and so forth. There's a huge number of dimensions along this can happen. And most importantly for us, in about 10-15% of cases, there is no bloodshed, no huge amounts of violence. Somehow, sometimes societies led by unusually pro-social and functional elites manage to navigate their way through this crisis and bring the ship of state, safely to the other side.
And what were the characteristics of those situations where there was a pro-social leader that brought the ship to the other side? Are there any standard things that you noticed?
Well, I can give you some examples, but this is actually why we are collecting so much data, because we want to first at least characterize statistically the different types of outcomes. And then we want to probe the causal factors. But this is very much work in progress. In fact, I don't know. I have no yet. I have, apart from saying that you have to shut down the wealth pump, right? Because that's how all societies, they actually left crisis, by shutting down the wealth pump, reversing the stagnation of the majority of population. This shuts down the elite overproduction and so on. But in each case, they've done it in very different ways. All right. And so I don't yet have a general lesson to.
So wouldn't naturally the wealth pump be shut down just by market forces like Weimar Germany or the Great Depression with a financial collapse? Or can you actually use policy and legislation to shrink the wealth pump?
Let's take the aftermath of 1929 in the United States, the stock market collapse. In fact, it was not just stock market collapse. United States had experienced terrible recessions before that. Like in the 1870s, there was a long recession, and so it was like every 20 years there was a recession, which actually some of them were even worse than the Great Depression. All right. What actually turned the country around was the institutional remaking of the country. It started it took like 30 years to do that, because it started at the beginning of the 20th century during the progressive era. All right. And then it was finished during the New Deal. All right. So that's actually what got United States not only out of crisis, but also without a revolution or civil war, because the previous crisis was, of course, ended with the Civil War, which took hundreds of thousands of casualties and really caused a lot of pain to the country. So. So the trick here is that it's not just a terrible war or terrible revolution or stock market collapse. The way it works is indirectly. It focuses the attention of the leaders on what they need to do in order to get the country back on track.
So we look at the elite overproduction, which you've described in the United States today, but does any society, looking back in history, is it inevitable that there is an elite overproduction, or does it only happen sometimes when things are stable for a long period of time?
Exactly. It follows after long periods of internal stability. And when the elites get used to the state of things, and I think that they can actually monkey with the system, make it work better for them, all right? And it will not ruin anything. This is called the iron law of oligarchy. Just because they have power, right, they can actually, try to get even more out of the system. And by doing that, they turn on the wealth pump. And then after some time, actually it takes 20, 30, 40 years, they actually look at ruination of their class as a result of a revolution of civil war.
So this wouldn't happen in pre-agricultural societies where we had 100, 300 people living on the savannah in Tanzania. This has to exist where there's storable, tradable surplus and commodities, right? Isn't this kind of a social optimal foraging dynamic with humans in a broader society?
Well, I would just say that, yes, in order to have a state collapse, you have to have a state. The states appeared about 5,000 years ago, and so we have this tripartite structure: the general population, people with power, elites, and the state structures, which is another agent that may have a lot of autonomy, for example. Interestingly enough, recently, I, together with my collaborators, we looked at the Neolithic societies, and they have their own collapses, actually pretty terrible collapses. But it's, of course, not a state collapse. It's just the conditions of war break out, and people run away, and whole areas, large regions get abandoned, essentially.
And even though they didn't have states, was there some analog to having elite overproduction and popular immiseration in those societies?
No, there it's more it's overpopulation.
Overpopulation.
Right. Yes. So when there are too many people, they live all in their politically independent villages, right? There is no overarching authority that would prevent conflicts from escalating. And so when the whole landscape fills up with villages, those people start competing over some scarce or precious resources, all right? And that leads to some violence. And then eventually they find themselves in the war. They forget how it all started. Now it's basically it's a blood revenge against all those bad guys.
And the other side thinks it's blood revenge against those bad guys.
Exactly.
So let me ask you this. You said earlier that once we get to this point, it's a very thin line. You also said that it's very difficult to predict more than the very near term because the initial conditions of future moments will change. But I'll ask you, Peter, a different question. Knowing all the things you know, and yes, it's not psychohistory, but it's mathematical chaos that you've studied, your entire career. If you were not advising someone today how to avert what's coming, that's a separate question. But if you were planting the seeds for a more stable future society that would not fall into these same stability breeds complacency and overproduction of elites, what sort of firewalls and constraints and laws or rules would you recommend to a future society to avoid this buildup and eventual different flavor of collapse for the state due to these trends that you observe all over history and all over the world?
That's a very good question. And in fact, that's a big reason why we do our science, is because we want to figure out how to prevent future collapses. Now we are in a revolutionary situation already. It's too late to prevent this revolution, right? But in the future, we can do it. And that's what our science actually can be predictive. It's predictive not of how the trajectory will unfold, because that depends too much on the actions of individual people, especially influential leaders. But it's predictive of what we should do to avoid such collapses. And in fact, our analysis shows that 5,000 years ago, the states were much, much more fragile. They would more easily collapse, and they would stay collapsed with more severe consequences for longer times. So we collectively, the humanity collectively, is learning. We are accumulating good institutions. Even if you think about democracy, of course, democratic institutions is not panacea. It's not going to, prevent necessarily those things, but it helps to manage the crisis in much less bloody way. And also things like productive economies. At least immiseration in the United States, it doesn't mean that the majority of people are starving like it would happen in 14th century France.
So it's relative immiseration, not absolute. We compare our situation to the recent past.
Yeah, no, it's actually absolute. I did not think it would get to this point, but in 2017, the average life expectancy for Americans started to decline even before COVID. And so now we are still not, we've regained some ground, but we are still below that 2017. So in some aspects of it, actually, are amazing. I never would have predicted that, to tell the truth.
So if you put a time capsule into the future post whatever happens, so let me start here. What are you predicting now? You have your 2023 book, and then you had your paper in 2010 predicting events in the 2020s in the United States. What do you think is going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years broadly in the U.S.?
First of all, one thing we can say that it's not over. So, many people thought that after 2020, when the ruling class quashed the revolution, right, it was over. No, unfortunately, these crisis periods always take a long time to resolve, and unfortunately, fast resolution usually requires a sea of blood. All right, so let's hope for a longer and resolution that would involve reforms that would change the country. All right, but exactly what happens is, as I said, we are now in situation of high sensitivity to initial conditions. Even a single individual can actually, if they are in the right place at the right time or the wrong place in the wrong time, they can push the trajectory either to a really chaotic civil war or put it on the trajectory of reforms and renovation. All right. So because this is so hugely contingent, all right, anybody who will try to predict to you that we're going to have this or that, they're either fooling you or they're themselves fools.
But do you have a base case? It's kind of too late to really change the current trajectory, I heard you say earlier.
Yeah. So, but look at this. We are still in a situation where there is no hot civil war. We are in a situation of cold civil war. So, some recommendations are actually don't start a hot civil war, even if you think you're right and Trump is horrible. All right, don't use violence to derail his presidency. And I say that not because I am, a partisan of Trump. I just know how easily violence can spiral up in these situations. So that's one thing, and also the ruling elites, they should now understand it's not Trump. It's not, bad, deplorables. I mean, they are the ones who led this country over the past 40 or 50 years to this situation. All right. So if they regain power, then they should follow in the footsteps of FDR or in England, the Chartist period. All right. So this is a serious situation, and you will have to sacrifice some of your interest, right? I mean, it doesn't mean that you have to give up all your billions, but you still would have to get the country to the situation where the fruits of economic labor are shared fairly, which means that owners, for example, of the businesses would be getting less than they are used to over the past 40 years. So the profits would be smaller. There still would be profits, but they would be smaller, and they would be in balance.
And are there examples in history where there was elite overproduction and the wealth pump had gotten out of control, and so there was popular immiseration, where the elites recognized the risk and they reversed a little bit of the gains from the wealth pump in order to stabilize society? Were there examples where that worked out?
Yeah, and I talk about them in my book. So, for example, the previous complete wave of this crisis, the crisis wave, is known to historians as the Age of Revolutions, right? So it's mostly from very late 18th century, peaking during the revolutions of 1848, and of course there were civil wars in China in 1860, United States, and so on and so forth. The only two major countries that escaped it were, first of all, the British Empire. And they managed to deal with it by adopting the right reforms. And the other one may surprise you, it was Tsarist Russia. So Tsarist Russia in 1860 was in a revolutionary situation. The peasants, who were half of them who were still serfs, they were burning the houses of their landlords. There was just the state lost all the legitimacy as a result of catastrophic defeat in the Crimean War. Tsar Alexander II made a speech. He told to the nobility, we'll either have revolution from below or revolution from above. Actually, it was because his brother was reading the book called Democracy in America, who suggested this thought to Alexander. So they did. It was over the period of about 10 years. It's called the Great Reforms. They freed the serfs, they completely reformed the system. And they bought Russia 50 years. Unfortunately, then during the 1905 and 1917 revolutions, Russia was put, especially 1917, under such huge geopolitical pressure that it broke. All right, but still, they gained Russia 50 years. That's actually was not a bad, achievement.
Do you ever read fiction, Peter, or like watch Netflix shows? Or I just get the feeling that you are interested in this topic and thinking about it and solving it all the time.
No, I do. Yes, I read. If I did not read fiction in the evening, my brain would keep churning. And so, yes, no, I don't. It's for my health reasons. I have certain routines that shut down the brain and allow me to rest and so on and so forth. And yeah, and I watch some, especially, but of course, some of the, movies that I watch, like the Game of Thrones. I mean, I can't watch it without saying, yes, this is how elite overproduction works.
Yeah, I hear you. So you've done all this amazing historical meta-analysis of and come up with this thesis of elite overproduction and immiseration of the common population. But how much of this is separate from energy and material resource depletion and the environment? And the ecology. I don't hear you talk about those things so much. Is this dynamic that you're observing independent of energy and ecology?
I do talk about this in my book because these are, I treat them as secondary factors, because we find that in about half of the crisis periods, there was a major major epidemic or even a pandemic. It's not ubiquitous, all right, but what we had, the COVID that we had, which really put the social system on the edge. Right, that actually is quite a typical situation. For example, the Black Death in 1348 killed half of the population of peasants, but much smaller proportion of the elites because they could escape it. As a result of it, the pyramid became even more top-heavy, and that's what caused France, for example, go into 100 years of hostility. And the same thing with climate. Climate can either, long stretches of good climate can extend good periods, right? Because they, for example, help against immiseration because the crops, yields grow, right, during the periods of good crisis. And vice versa, when you have a period of famine, that could be a trigger for system collapsing. So in France in 1789, the trigger that actually released the pent-up pressure was the sharp jump in food prices. Okay, it resulted in hunger strikes, urban riots, and that was the final sort of straw that broke the camel's back.
Does the trends in the United States that you're monitoring and you've discussed, are these common throughout the world right now, or is the United States a special case?
Oh, no, not at all. In fact, but keep in mind that there is no strict synchronicity here. All right. So France, for example, if we judging by such proxies as the growth of inequality in wealth and income, in France it started growing much later than in the United States. And then if you look at places like China has only recently emerged from its own end times, which lasted for over a century. So they still have a lot, of slack to go through before they get to their own end times.
So the dynamic that you're describing is kind of ambivalent about the absolute magnitude of wealth in a country. For instance, there may be some materially poorer countries in the world that have much lower GDP per capita than the United States, but that they have a better elite versus immiseration in the populace level relative to the United States. Is that true?
Yeah. So, in fact, immiseration, even though it's now in the United States in the absolute terms because of the life expectancy, but in reality, of course, humans are social creatures, and as we grow up in our parents' households, we sort of get imprinted on what normal life should be like. All right. And so, if you are exceeding, as was happening from the 1930s all the way into the 1980s, right? If the next generation lives better than their parents, they are quite happy, even though back in the in the 1930s, or even go back to 11th century France, right? Those peasants were poor, but their life was actually as good as their parents, and so they were not rebelling. All right, so that is a dynamic that is very important.
So it's our expectations as a society that play a large role on whether we're in misery or not.
Yeah, it's the same thing for the elites. So one way that elite overproduction is solved is, of course, when they get exterminated or, forcefully driven down. But in many situations, many of the elite aspirants just give up, right? Especially if they have some decent job to go to, right? Which is why you need to solve immiseration. All right. If you solve immiseration, then many of those elite aspirants, they would basically say, "Okay, to hell with that. I'll just become a carpenter or whatever." So it is very much expectations and ability to match your expectations.
So recently I had Jeremy Grantham on this show, who outlined a prediction of declining human population in the not too distant future due to plummeting fertility rates, partially due to endocrine disrupting chemicals. But how would a decline in overall population in the world or overall population in various countries affect the pressures on mass immiseration and elite overproduction?
So here we are in good shape because very many of these crisis periods in the past resulted in population decline. So for immiseration, population decline is an unvarnished good because it reduces the supply of labor. All right, and it tends not to affect too much the demand for it, or less. And as a result of that, we saw, for example, after the Black Death, the English peasants started eating white bread, drinking beer, which they could not afford before because they were so immiserated, and things like that. Of course, before we can get on the sustainable trajectory, societies have to deal with literal production. So in a short term, population decline exacerbates literal production because of the social pyramid becoming too top heavy. All right. So you have to somehow deal with that problem. But eventually this is one of the mechanical ways of shutting down the wealth pump is essentially is making labor supply to be insufficient for the jobs you need, because that inevitably will drive up the wages, and then you have the reversal of immiseration.
So interjecting my own work on describing the carbon pulse as a driver of our wealth and productivity, we have effectively 500 billion human workers in the form of coal, oil, and gas that we're adding to the work of machines, adding to the 5 billion actual workers. And as that fossil workforce gradually retires and declines, that's also going to have an impact on immiseration and the dynamic you discuss.
Yes, but the fortunate thing is that this carbon-based energy is in the process of being replaced with especially solar. Solar technology development has been amazing in terms of the costs of producing electricity and storing it, the batteries, So many people, techno-optimists, and I'm sort of on their side, they think that we will just have huge amounts of plentiful energy just in the 5-10 years period. Let's think about it. If you just put half of Arizona, which nobody uses, just put, solar panels there, you can supply the whole world, essentially, for many decades to come.
Have you thought about how artificial intelligence might influence and impact the science backdrop that you've laid out here with elite overproduction and immiseration?
Yes, in fact, I have a blog post about this. So here's my thinking, that previous technological advances have replaced workers, right? Workers have very little power because they're not organized. Now AI has come for the elites. It is replacing elites. Remember, I was saying that there is a credential route to power. If you want to gain a political office in the United States and you don't have wealth, what do? You go to the law school. Now, about 2 years ago, we produced in the United States 3 times as many lawyers as there were positions for them. All right. Now, about half of those positions are being eliminated. Just 2 weeks ago, I was at a conference of pension fund holders, and they're saying that I have fired all my legal assistants.
We have 3 times the graduates than there are law jobs available, but now AI has caused that to be 6 to 1?
Exactly. And lawyers are the most dangerous profession from the point of view of social stability. Lenin was a lawyer, Castro was a lawyer, Robespierre was a lawyer, Gandhi was a lawyer, although he led a peaceful revolution.
Is it shorthand that we have lawyer overproduction?
Yeah, we have overproduction of many. We have overproduction of PhDs also. But PhDs, professors are not terribly dangerous people. Lawyers are. And I say that not because I hate them or anything, all right? But it's just historically, they have been the leaders of many revolutions and civil wars.
Why do you think that is? Is it because lawyers know how to think in logical Machiavellian ways? Or what do you think explains that?
Yeah, partly that, because you have to be very flexible ideologically. You cannot just start by being a socialist. You just think about people like Stalin. Stalin kept changing his ideology depending on what the landscape was. As a result of that, he got ahead. Whereas Trotsky, he kept pushing for the world revolution, right? And so he ended up, ice pick in his brain. So that's being flexible and being able to argue any side is actually an advantage in a successful revolutionary.
So standing here today at the dawn of 2025, what do you think is the single most pressing issue to address?
First of all, keep things peaceful. Don't allow any violence to escalate. And secondly, the Trump administration has really, from what they are saying, they don't really have an idea. First of all, they don't understand, the idea that you have to shut down the wealth pump. Interestingly enough, some of that members, so J.D. Vance, for example, or Tucker Carlson, they actually talk the right talk periodically, although they also say many other things, right? But I don't see any understanding of this as being the key thing for us to resolve.
So let me put you on the spot, kind of. If someone from the Trump administration were to watch this podcast, or even the next administration after that, hypothetically, and they're like, oh, I've heard about this cryodynamics and Dr. Peter Turchin, and they contact you, what would be like a short list of recommendations that you would give to slow what's coming and make it more likely to be bloodless and a possible transition to something lower scale but stable? What would be a few things that you would say?
You know what I would do? I would do a self-serving thing. I would say that we have, clearly we are studying this is a very important question. How do you avoid civil war? All right. We have amassed quite a lot of data, but there is a lot of science that needs to be done. We've been writing grant proposals, and they get denied. All right, because people think what we do is unimportant. So I'll just say now, I would say that give us resources so we can hire the historians, data scientists, modelers, and then give us 4 or 5 years, because fortunately research takes time. And then we'll come up with much, much better answers for you than I could just wing now.
Do you think we have 4 or 5 years?
I hope so. Why not? What we need to do is what in epidemiology they call flatten the curve, right? We need to flatten the curve. We need to give ourselves time. This is, by the way, what historical example of that is the Chartist period. They were able to flatten the curve because during this time, which is like 1830s, 40s, and 50s, 1830s through 1850s and 60s in UK, they actually shipped millions of immiserated population to places like Australia. And they also shipped hundreds of thousands of surplus elites to positions in the British Empire, in India, Africa, Burma, and so on and so forth. So there are some ways we can flatten the curve. But what we need to do is flattening the curve just gives us time to get the right reforms enacted.
So I have 100 more questions for you. This is like so overlapping with my work, but I want to keep my word to you because you had a limitation on time. So I'm going to ask you just a few closing questions I ask all my guests. Do you have any personal advice to listeners of this show who are well aware of Dennis Meadows and Joseph Tainter, and probably many of them have read your book? They're aware of the times that we live in. Do you have any personal advice on how to manage this, whether the listener is an elite or a commoner, just general audience? About 40% of our listeners are in the United States. The rest are international.
Especially to the young people, I would say this, that there is no impenetrable border between commoners and elites. So become elite. There are a variety of ways you can do it. You can start up a business, earn, 100 millions, and then you could use that money to fund social movements, or become influential blogger, or, work your way up, in the administration and acquire power that way. And then also organize, associate with other people, spread the better ideas, don't be tempted by violence. So those are very simple, suggestions.
Try to get some social power and use the social power for pro-social ends.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you for formulating that.
What do you care most about in the world, Professor Turchin?
The truth. I'm a scientist, first and foremost.
No one has ever answered that question that way. I care about the truth too, and I'm trying to unpack it hour by hour, week by week. If you could wave a magic wand, and being a scientist, you probably don't like this concept, but there was no personal recourse to your future, what is one thing you would do to improve human and planetary futures?
Well, am I also a world dictator?
Yes.
Yes. Well, then I actually know what to do. All those world dictators, they tend to have their heads cut off. But yeah, I would just, first of all, I would go to Washington and install myself as the dictator. And then I would select better people who have an idea what needs to be done. And some of the politicians would be both from the Democrats and from the Republicans. All right. Get the social scientists, economists, sociologists, and so forth, and so on and so forth. But this is completely ridiculous.
Well, it is ridiculous, but it acts as an Overton window of what actually might work, and then it expands the horizon, and we might move in that direction. What you're saying is, instead of politicians seeking personal power, to somewhere in the government have technical, capable people with social science, natural science, system science at high levels of authority.
Yeah. And one thing is that what I would definitely not do, I would not say that, okay, do this, that, and that, because that's not how, even if you're a dictator, that's not how things work. You need to, the most important thing that the dictator can do is to appoint the right people, right? You need, that's because all action is collective, all good action is collective action.
So for anyone interested in the details of how you analyzed all these trends and your work field called cryodynamics. Is there somewhere they can read about the methods you used in your modeling? How do they find more about your work?
Sure. In fact, in End Times, there is an appendix. There are 3 appendix chapters, and there I try to explain what cryodynamics does in non-technical language.
And do you have a website or something where people can find you?
I have a website, peterturchin.com.
Okay.
Right. So that's, and in fact, I am planning to restart my blogging. There were some reasons why not, but that's actually will happen before the end of the year.
So this has been wonderful. I think we just scratched the surface of this. We've talked about elite overproduction and immiseration and how this has worked out in the past. If you were to come back on this podcast, Peter, what is one topic that you have a particular passion and interest in relevant to our future that you'd be willing to take a deep dive in?
I'm not whistling, but it depends on what will happen this year. All right, because if we are in the middle of a hot civil war, then we would need to be thinking about how do we end that. But if there is a lot of intellectual turmoil about what do we need to do to what kind of reforms need to be adopted, that would be a very different conversation. When you leave history, this is actually, you have to adapt.
Adapt, yeah.
You have to adapt.
So, well, let's see how things are in 6 or 9 months, and maybe you come back. Thank you so much for your important work, and please make sure to read some fiction and watch some Netflix at times.
Yes, you'll do that.
If you enjoyed or learned from this episode of The Great Simplification, please follow us on your favorite podcast platform. You can also visit thegreatsimplification.com for references and show notes from today's conversation. And to connect with fellow listeners of this podcast, check out our Discord channel. This show is hosted by me, Nate Hagens, edited by No Troublemakers Media, and produced by Misty Stinnett, Leslie Batlutz, Brady Hyen, and Lizzie Sirianni.